Level 0. Every apocalypse has to start somewhere, and strangely enough, it never begins with a dramatic explosion or a secret message broadcast across the sky. It usually begins with something painfully ordinary: a cough that sounds a little too wet, a fever that refuses to cool down, a strange rash that a stubborn patient assumes will disappear after a good night of sleep. Patient 0 is never aware of the chaos they're about to cause. In most stories, they are just trying to get through their day without collapsing on the floor of a grocery store. Scientists often point out that real outbreaks begin quietly because viruses and bacteria excel at hiding in plain sight. History is full of early carriers who had no idea they were walking time bombs. Typhoid Mary is a classic example, a woman who felt perfectly fine while unintentionally infecting entire communities. In a zombie scenario, the same pattern appears, except the symptoms take a far stranger turn. Imagine a doctor examining the first victim, assuming it is a routine flu case, only to realize the patient's pulse is fading while their muscles twitch with unnatural spasms. Maybe a lab worker tries to reassure everyone that the situation is under control while quietly backing toward the door. These early moments always feel comically avoidable, the kind of thing you would laugh at in a movie, right before remembering that this tiny mistake will eventually swallow the entire world. By the time anyone notices that the first infected person refuses to stay still after clinical death, confusion shifts into disbelief. That disbelief quickly becomes fear. And as the people in the room try to decide whether this is a medical emergency or a supernatural nightmare, the outbreak prepares to burst past the point of stopping. Level 1 begins the moment the world outside discovers what really walked out of that room. Level 1. A single infected person is unsettling, but a neighborhood outbreak is when things stop feeling like an isolated medical mystery and start feeling like the universe is tapping you on the shoulder saying you should probably run. It usually begins with the kind of strange neighborhood chatter that spreads faster than any official announcement. Someone claims they saw a person wandering around at dawn with a blank stare. Another swears a neighbor tried to bite someone. Meanwhile, the emergency hotline is so overwhelmed that callers hear a cheerful, pre-recorded voice telling them to stay calm while everything around them is very clearly not calm at all. Local outbreaks in the real world often follow this same chaotic pattern. During the early days of SARS and H1N1, reports came in waves. Some were accurate, some were exaggerated. Many were people trying to understand why ambulances were flying down their streets with no explanation. In a zombie scenario, the confusion is doubled because the first responders are the very people most likely to encounter the infection head-on. Picture a firefighter approaching a collapsed person in the middle of a quiet street. The crowd insists the victim is unconscious. Then the victim suddenly rises, ignoring every law of biology the firefighter learned in training. Panic spreads instantly. People run without knowing which direction is safe. Others record everything on their phones in the worst possible attempt at documentation. A few unlucky individuals approach the incident out of curiosity, believing it is a prank or performance art until they realize the screaming is a little too real. Even hospitals become centers of bedlam. Waiting rooms overflow with injured people who refuse to sit still. Medical staff try to isolate patients but end up locking themselves in storage rooms because the infected do not respond to restraints or medication. The neighborhood transforms into a patchwork of locked doors, flickering streetlights, and unanswered phone calls. Local outbreaks always feel like they could be contained if someone just made the right decision at the right moment. Unfortunately, the moment passes quickly, and while the neighborhood is busy fighting for answers, the infection is already spilling across bridges, highways, and bus routes. Citywide overrun begins the second the outbreak escapes the edges of the map. Level 2. A local outbreak might look chaotic, but a full city overrun is where the situation shifts from confusion to complete collapse. At this stage, the infection moves faster than emergency services can respond, and the entire city begins to behave like a living organism that has suddenly lost control of its own limbs. If you have ever watched traffic instantly fall apart because one car stalled during rush hour, imagine that same effect spreading across every street at the same time. That is the moment a city realizes it is in trouble. Hospitals are usually the first major institutions to fall. During real-world crises like early Ebola flare-ups or the peak of the influenza pandemic in 1918, hospitals reach capacity within days. In a zombie scenario, the collapse happens in hours. Doctors wheel patients into hallways because rooms are full, only to discover that the people they are treating are not behaving like normal patients. Some refuse sedation, others rise from flatlined monitors. Medical staff retreat deeper into the building until entire wings become unusable. Law enforcement faces a similar spiral. During Hurricane Katrina, officers struggled with communication breakdowns and overwhelming calls for help. A zombie outbreak amplifies this problem dramatically. Police radios crackle with reports of crowds, roadblocks, and unidentified violent incidents. Officers try to set up barricades but quickly abandon them when the infected push through with unnatural determination. Within a short time, precincts send out final distress messages before going silent. Highways turn into monuments of panic. Cars are abandoned in every lane as drivers attempt to flee but end up trapped in gridlock. People leave their vehicles and run on foot, accidentally turning highways into massive funnels that lead straight into danger. Subways and buses shut down, not because of official orders, but because the infected begin appearing in stations where there is nowhere to escape. As city services disappear, the environment itself becomes dangerous. Fires break out without anyone left to respond. Elevators jam between floors. Streetlights flicker off one district at a time. What once felt like a predictable routine now resembles a maze designed to trap anyone still alive. At this point, the city is no longer a place where survival revolves around quick thinking. It becomes a test of endurance, and the infection begins spreading beyond city limits. All it takes is one fleeing crowd or one failed checkpoint before the disaster jumps from a single region to an entire nation. That is where the national breakdown begins, and things get far worse. Level 3. Once the infection escapes a single city, containment becomes almost impossible. A nation is simply too large, too interconnected, and too dependent on constant movement to slow anything this aggressive. Highways that link major regions now act like conveyor belts, carrying the outbreak from one population center to the next. Every airport, train station, and bus terminal becomes a potential ignition point. Within hours, officials realize they are no longer dealing with a regional emergency, but a national crisis spiraling out of control. Governments often turn to strong measures during extreme situations. During the influenza pandemic of 1918, entire towns sealed their borders. During SARS, travel restrictions appeared almost overnight. In a zombie scenario, these actions escalate dramatically. Borders close to civilians. Martial law is declared. Cities are placed under forced quarantine with military checkpoints trying to separate the healthy from the infected. But even the most disciplined forces are not prepared for adversaries who feel no pain, do not hesitate, and do not retreat. Military units attempt coordinated responses, yet the infection spreads too quickly. During real combat situations, losing a position might take hours or days. Here, entire regions fall overnight. Communication lines overload. Command centers receive conflicting reports from every direction. Troops sent to reinforce one area discover that the situation changed before they even arrived. The infected move through towns like storm fronts, leaving confusion behind them. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens try to make sense of the sudden shift in national tone. One morning, the news warns people to stay calm. By evening, the same network broadcasts emergency messages urging viewers to take shelter. Grocery stores are cleared out, gas stations run dry. People who never imagined preparing for disaster now scramble to find anything useful. The sense of normal life dissolves faster than anyone can adjust. As the national structure collapses, regions begin to operate on their own. Some areas attempt to form local governments, while others fall into silence. Transportation networks shut down. Power grids fail. The nation fractures into isolated pockets, each trying to survive without any guarantee that help is still coming. By this point, the infection is no longer contained by borders or national defenses. It is preparing to leap across oceans and continents, setting the stage for an even larger catastrophe. That is when the continental spread begins and the world starts to go dark. Level 4. Once the infection reaches multiple nations, the world shifts from panic to pure instability. A continental outbreak is not just a medical emergency, it is a chain reaction created by millions of people moving, escaping, searching for safety, and unknowingly carrying the infection across borders. Real-world history shows how easily this can happen. During the Black Death, entire regions collapsed as traveling merchants carried the disease across trade routes. In modern times, flights can move a virus from one country to another in a matter of hours. In a zombie scenario, this same pattern unfolds at terrifying speed. The first clue that things are spiraling out of control appears when cities in completely different regions report identical incidents within the same day. No one understands how the infection jumped so far so quickly. Officials blame overcrowded ports. Others point to overwhelmed airports. Some whisper about infected travelers hiding symptoms just long enough to slip through screenings. But the truth is simple. Humanity travels constantly, and any contagious threat can ride along without asking permission. Refugee waves become the largest force accelerating the disaster. People fleeing their collapsing nations carry what they believe are ordinary injuries or stress symptoms. Doctors in neighboring countries attempt to process the arrivals, unaware that some refugees are only hours away from turning violent. Border checkpoints swell with crowds that grow more desperate by the minute. Soldiers try to maintain order, but one infection inside a packed crowd sends everything into a downward spiral. Within days, several nations lose control at the same time. Entire coastlines go silent. Military broadcasts from different countries begin sounding eerily similar, filled with final warnings and abrupt cutoffs. Satellite images show entire regions darkening at night as power grids fail. What once looked like a vibrant, connected stretch of civilization now resembles a chain of abandoned islands scattered across a dark sea. International cooperation collapses under the weight of sheer chaos. Countries that once shared intelligence and resources now fight to protect whatever remains of their own territory. Communication lines disappear one by one until continents that once felt tightly linked drift into isolation. At this stage, the infection has grown beyond containment. The world is not facing a regional disaster or a continental emergency. It is facing a complete global unraveling, and the next phase brings the full weight of that reality. Global infection is unavoidable, and it arrives faster than anyone expects. Level 5. A continental outbreak is terrifying, but global infection is where the world finally understands that there is no safe corner left to retreat to. Once the infection leaps across oceans and begins appearing on every major landmass, the disaster stops feeling like a crisis and starts feeling like the closing chapter of civilization. In real pandemics, worldwide spread has always been a matter of timing. The influenza pandemic of 1918 circled the Earth in multiple waves before people understood how fast it moved. Modern travel makes that process even quicker. In a zombie scenario, the spread becomes almost instant, with each new hotspot lighting up the map like a chain of exploding sparks. Satellites become the most reliable witnesses. They pick up images of cities burning, highways frozen in place, and coastal regions sinking into darkness night after night. Global communication networks collapse so quickly that entire nations vanish from the conversation without warning. A message appears one morning from a government spokesperson assuring citizens that the situation is under control, and by evening, that same region goes completely silent. The speed of disappearance becomes its own form of horror. International relief efforts fall apart almost as soon as they begin. Countries that once sent medical teams across borders now struggle to protect their last standing cities. Supply chains that fed billions stop functioning. Cargo ships drift with no crews. Air traffic dwindles until the sky is empty except for streaks of smoke rising from burning runways. Scientific communities attempt a last wave of cooperation. Virologists share genetic samples in a desperate effort to understand the infection. Labs run non-stop experiments searching for any weakness. But their work becomes harder as facilities lose power, staff vanish, and data networks fail. Even when breakthroughs are rumored, there is no certainty the information will reach anyone who can use it. Global culture fractures. People search for safe zones that no longer exist. Some regions attempt mass evacuations that end in chaos. Others seal their borders completely, only to fall when internal outbreaks spark days later. The idea of a stable nation becomes a memory rather than a reality. At this point, the infection has surpassed every scientific response, political barrier, and survival strategy. What remains is not a global society fighting to win, but scattered survivors trying to stay alive while the world they knew caves in around them. This is where civilization begins to crumble entirely, setting the stage for the next and most devastating phase. Level 6. Once global infection becomes unstoppable, civilization does not fall all at once. It unravels piece by piece like a massive machine losing its gears in slow motion. At first, countries try to maintain a sense of order by keeping power grids online and essential services running. But without workers, fuel, or secure infrastructure, everything begins to flicker out. Cities that once glowed through the night now fade into darkness, one district at a time. What used to be the routine hum of modern life becomes a silence so deep that survivors describe it as unsettling. History gives us small hints of how fragile civilization can be. During the New York blackout of 2003, the entire city was thrown into confusion in a matter of hours. When Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico, power loss affected millions for months. Those events had functioning governments, supply chains, and international aid. A zombie outbreak offers none of that. There are no reinforcements, no repair crews, no second attempts. When the grid dies, it stays dead. Transportation networks collapse next. Highways that once carried thousands of cars a day turn into graveyards of rusting vehicles. Airports fall silent as runways become overrun or abandoned. Rail systems break down when no one is left to maintain tracks or operate control centers. animals. Without transportation, food and medicine cease to move. Entire communities run out of supplies and scatter into the wilderness in search of anything edible. Governments dissolve quietly. Some leaders vanish. Others attempt final broadcasts urging unity, only for those signals to vanish beneath static. Local authorities try to form temporary councils, but survival becomes too urgent and chaotic. People shift from structured societies to small bands of survivors, each relying on their own skills and instincts. Some groups attempt to rebuild order, forming scavenger routes and shared communication signals. Others turn hostile, fighting over abandoned stores or water sources. Humanity shrinks into isolated pockets. A family might live in the hills above a ruined city, unaware that a group of survivors is gathered only a few miles away. Communication breaks down completely. Without radio repeaters or working towers, distance becomes an impenetrable barrier. By now, the world is no longer a civilization. It is a scattering of desperate people clinging to life among billions of roaming infected. But even this fractured existence is not the final stage. The next level reveals what happens when humanity approaches the edge of total disappearance. Level 7. Reaching the stage of human near extinction is not a sudden event. It is the quiet endpoint of a long collapse, the moment when the living become so few that the world barely remembers them. Less than 0.01% of humanity remains. To put that into perspective, imagine a stadium built for 50,000 people. Now picture only 5 still inside it, hiding in the shadows while the rest of the seats are filled with the undead. That is the scale of disappearance we are dealing with. The shift from civilization collapse to human near extinction happens when the infected no longer need to chase people. They simply occupy the world by default. Cities overflow with them. Forests echo with their footsteps. Shorelines crawl with bodies pulled in by the tide, only to rise again. Even the deep wilderness is no longer safe. What used to be remote escape zones have become paths for wandering herds that travel endlessly, guided by sound, scent, or instinct long after their minds have vanished. Small survivor groups are forced into extreme isolation. Communication becomes almost mythical. People send signals using smoke or mirrors, unsure if anyone alive is even close enough to see them. Some survivors try to create hidden settlements in mountains, caves, or underground structures. Others stay constantly on the move, living like ghosts among ruins. They live off expired cans, wild plants, or whatever they can scavenge from places too dangerous for anyone else to enter. The psychological strain becomes a danger all its own. Studies of real isolated groups, such as polar research teams or long-duration space missions, show how quickly the human mind begins to fracture without social contact. Now multiply that stress by the constant threat of being hunted. Survivors talk to themselves, cling to memories, or invent routines simply to anchor their sanity. Every day becomes a test of persistence rather than skill. The infected dominate every environment. Swarms drift through abandoned skyscrapers. Rural fields lie trampled under endless footprints. Even oceans hold floating hordes carried by currents, waiting to wash ashore. Humanity becomes a rumor whispered among the last few individuals who still believe a future is possible. But as bleak as this stage is, it also creates a strange and fragile possibility. Because when humanity is pushed to its absolute limit, the next question becomes whether the species can rise from the edge or finally fade into the shadows forever.